Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Beckham. Let's talk more photography and image editing. It used to be said that if we kept the sun over our left or right shoulder, we would get a well-exposed picture almost every time. Now that's very good advice, but of course we often see far more interesting pictures when the sun or the light source is actually in front of the camera. Sometimes it's just in shot, sometimes just out of the shot. But this generally makes for a tricky exposure. Tricky because a little exposure one way or the other could be critical. Now the author did spot that possibility here, and they shot 3 exposures via automatic exposure bracketing. In a recent video, I took a similar situation to this from a lighting point of view, and we merged all 3 images together into a high dynamic range image. Now, if we look at these 3 images, we could do the same. But if we look more carefully at the exposure the camera felt was right, we'll see that the lighting here, or the exposure, was just about within the camera's dynamic range. Now, as we look at these 3 exposures, and we could look at many more like them, this seems to me to be a giant thumbs up for automatic exposure bracketing. I like it because it speeds up the shooting. Now, this is quite important if you're on a beach at sunset and you've only got really 10 or 15 minutes and you want to get some varied shots. It also prevents us from continually having to check exposure on the LCD screen, because with 3 exposures, 1 stop between each one, we're reasonably confident we've got something we can work with. And of course, it's very easy to pick the best exposure for editing later while we're sitting in front of a large screen monitor. Now, if we do find that the contrast range was a little bit higher than we thought, then we have 3 shots that we could combine into a high dynamic range image. It seems this automatic exposure bracketing technique gives us the best of all worlds. This image has appeal for other reasons too. Look at the composition. That tree is perfectly placed. Another strong point is the line of that sugarcane, which is starting on our left-hand side pretty strongly and taking us in that lovely curve right the way through the image, but it stops before the sugarcane leaves the frame on the right-hand side, and that's adding depth to the landscape. On top of that, we have the perfect lead into the picture with the rail tracks. This is how the sugarcane is harvested by a narrow gauge train, and those tracks have added great appeal here, and also they contribute to the feeling of depth within the picture. As we look at those tracks, they take us around the curve, but they disappear just before that big solid tree, so we're stopped at that point. So again, we're not taken out of the picture as we would be if the tracks could be seen right the way around to the right hand side of the picture on the edge of the frame. We do have a little bit of contrast to deal with up in the top right. And if we look at the histogram at the top right of our screen, we can see that the clipping warning is actually lit up, but I'm sure we can redeem it to a satisfactory level. We also have just 1 or 2 small distractions in the bottom right corner with those uprights which seem to be going nowhere, not the pole containing the wire, but the others just to the left. But this sort of image editing is typical of a lot of the work we need to do, and this raw image is worth some effort. I'm going to begin by opening up the basic tab. I don't think we need to consider a crop here. There's nothing for us to crop away. What I'm going to do is just warm up the image just a tiny amount. I'm going to use the temperature slider, and it is just going to be a small amount. And as I always say, when we're moving the sliders this small, it's really just personal preference. But now we need to look at that contrast issue, and as we come down the sliders, we're going to bring the highlights fully down, and we're going to bring the shadows a fair way up, and I think that looks pretty good. Once I've changed those two, that sort of prompts me really to go back to the exposure and drop that down a little bit. Because the tree, the big tree, is against a very bright background and a lot of light coming through, I think we can accept it being quite a solid tone. Now moving down, I'm going to take a look at the whites and the blacks, although I don't think we need too much in the way of black sliders, but maybe I'll just move the whites to see the effect. It just affects mainly my clouds, but I would like to have brought up the tone in the middle of the picture just to highlight those seed heads on the sugarcane there. But maybe we'll do that in a second or two with an adjustment brush. So let's continue down. I don't think we've got anything to gain by touching the blacks, so we'll reset those. Clarity maybe. Let's have a nice bit of clarity here, and maybe a small amount of vibrance to lift those lovely rich greens of the tropical North Queensland. So I think I'll go to the next most important issue, and that's the sky right at the top. For that, I think I'll use a graduated filter. So we'll select that from the top right. We'll click and drag somewhere down here. You can see we're getting a bit of warmth coming through there. I don't think that's a problem at all. I'm just going to touch the V key to hide that selection. I'm going to bring the highlights down even more, and the exposure down as far as I can get it, without taking that tree down too dark, and I think that I could live with. I could do a little bit more blue in the top there, but I don't think it's really critical to the image that we're viewing. So the next thing I'd like to do is to look at that heavy shadow caused by the tree in the cane as it's going from the left-hand side over here. I think we can do this with an adjustment brush, so I'm just going to touch my control key, click and drag to get the image a little bit bigger on screen. We can't do a great deal here, but I'd like to just take away the worst of that solid shadow. So I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush. You can see there's already been a few changes here. I'll just double click those as opposed to resetting the brush. We can reset the brush, of course, by just first brushing onto the picture and then clicking on the pin. But here, when there's only just a couple of sliders been moved, just double click them. So what am I looking for here? I'm looking for a little bit of shadow detail maybe, and I'm looking for a little bit of exposure too. Now I quite like to work with the flow of my brush quite low. I like to build up the effect that I'm creating. So I'm just going to brush over these areas. Now you can see straight away that that looks to me to be a little bit on the heavy side. So maybe I can hit Ctrl Z to undo that. I'm going to increase the feather, and I'm going to drop back a little bit of the shadows and a little bit of that exposure. And I'm just going to do this quite gently. It's still a little bit fast, so maybe I can even drop down the flow to something like 3. I don't want to overdo this, and it's very easy for the tools here to run away with us. You can see I'm being extremely delicate with what I'm doing, just to raise the worst of those shadows, but without going too far. Ctrl 0 will fit the image back on screen. Now I can see that shadow fully on screen. I think I'll just give it one more wipe along there and around there just to lift it a little more. This solid area on the left is good because that's holding us in and sending us around. So if we wanted to lighten it a bit round there, we could do. Personal choice. but I would like to do something with the highlights here. So what I'm going to do is to select the little plus sign for my brush, because I'm going to start a new brush. Let me begin by zooming in, and I'm just going to click on that area. So I've anchored the pin, so when we go over to the settings, you can see all the settings that we've just used. Now we don't want them, so we can double click. What we want here is to maybe raise the highlights a little bit. And do we need a bit of shadow, a bit of exposure too? I'm not too sure until I actually go onto the area and just brush over this. And again, look how delicate that is. And what I've got to do now is go along that line, and if I need to, zoom in more and just bring up all of these seed heads just a tiny amount. It only took me a couple of minutes to deal with those seed heads, because don't forget we're targeting the highlights. All I'd like to do with this image, I think, is to give it a little bit of a vignette. Then I'm going to open it up into Photoshop. So I'm going to select my radial filter from the toolbox, and I'll double click in the center. Right click immediately to reset all of the settings. And I think I'll just bring it in a little bit from the edge, not very much. And I'm going to touch the V key to hide that selection. The feather is up fairly high at 76. So all I want to do here is just put a little bit of a vignette around the outer edge. It does mean in some respects I'm darkening down the shadows that I lightened, but these things happen. But that's looking a lot better, I think. Just that little amount is all we need. If you find moving these sliders a small amount a little bit tricky sometimes, I'll double click to reset that. Put your cursor in these little boxes and you can do the same thing with the up and down arrows. If I just press and hold, there you can see us going far too far. But it can be useful to use those options from time to time if you just want a small change. So now I'm going to go down to my Open Object button and open this up into Photoshop. I think I'll deal with a couple of small points that I mentioned earlier in the main screen of Photoshop. Now, as you may have heard me say in previous videos, I've opened this up as a smart object, but to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to need it. But it isn't bad practice to keep it as long as possible. So what we'll do is we'll keep with the good practice of making a copied layer, Control J, but then I can right click just alongside the thumbnail and rasterize it. And the work I'd like to do on this is going to involve the healing brush. So I think I'll put all of my work on a new layer above this one, so I can select that from the bottom of the layers palette. Now when we select the tool we want to use, I'm going to try to use the Spot Healing Brush, we just need to make sure that we have Content Aware set, which is the default. The important one is this one here, Sample All Layers. That isn't ticked by default, and if you tick that, what happens is we sample the main image, but we do all of the repairs on that new blank layer. So there's never a risk. So let's zoom in and have a go. Control and spacebar will bring up the zoom tool. I can click and drag, and we can make a start. We can change the size of the brush using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. So let's deal with this little bit first. That's not looking too bad. Now I'm going to go to the top here and we'll just come down to this area and we'll just take a look at what we've done and down to that shaded area. That's not looking too bad. Now anytime you're doing this sort of work, if you feel that it's not doing a really thorough job, then go back to your toolbox and select the healing brush tool, because it works in a very similar way, but we have to choose a sample point. But you do need to remember to look up at the options at the top of the screen and set current and below, otherwise you'll be sampling directly onto the image or painting directly onto the image. So here, for example, I could adjust the size of my brush. I could hold the Alt key and sample. And sometimes the way to make these tools work really well is to sample quite often from different areas. That way we don't tend to see the work that we've done. Now I'm going to get rid of all that shadow down there, and now move over to this side to get rid of this bit. You can see me moving my point I'm drawing from quite often. Anytime you see that little target appear, I'm clicking to make a new selection. But I am working very quick and what I call dirty here, because I'm conscious I'm making a video and I don't want to bore you all to death. So there you are. Let's say that we're happy with that. When we hit Ctrl-0, we'd never know those posts were there. In fact, I think I'll take these ones away over on the right hand side too. Let's have a go at those as well. In fact, you've seen how this is done, so I'll clear those four and I'll be back in a moment. Now, having removed those distractions, I've saved this as a Photoshop file, so I've still got my original smart object, and I've got the work we've done here, which we can see if I turn that layer on and off. But because I've saved it and it's safely stored on my drive, I'm going to go to the top right and choose to flatten the image. I think the image is complete, but maybe I would look at doing one more thing. Maybe I'd look at going to my dodge tool over on the left hand side. I'd probably set it for mid-tones, and an exposure I'll start at around 10%. And I'd be looking to just raise the tone on those rails. I wouldn't raise them right along the edge here, but somewhere around here, just to highlight them around that nice curve. To do that, we would need to zoom in quite a lot. And in fact, now I've done that, maybe mid-tone is not a good choice. I may need to switch to highlights. Let me reduce the size of the brush. I think I will go back to highlights. And what I'm thinking of doing here is just a tiny amount. This is that sort of delicate stuff, which I wonder sometimes when I do these things, whether people that are watching are thinking, is this guy real? Is this really going to make a big difference to the image? Well, I'm afraid that's a choice you're going to have to make yourself. But what you'll find with image editing is it's a series of small steps. And it's not often that we make a step that's so significant that that alone improves the image. You can see that I'm doing this in a very delicate fashion, and I'm going to just continue a little while longer and finish off what I think needs to be done. So as the image spins round on the screen, we're looking now at the untouched raw file. This is the original we began with. And here's the image we've created, just by balancing those shadows and highlights. I'll see you next time, but before you go, don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to my channel, and you can download any of these videos from my website.